Edgar Mittelholzer was born in British Guyana exactly 105 years ago today, on the 16th of December 1909. He was to become the first of the Caribbean literati to be awarded the esteemed Guggenheim Fellowship, and indeed to make a professional career out of writing novels. Several of his 22 novels, his first published in 1941, his last posthumously in 1965. So several of his novels were published into at least 6 different European languages, with his most universally respected novel, A Morning at the Office, being published by Penguin. Other published works include an anti-capitalist novella, a travel journal, an autobiography, numerous articles, short stories, and poems. According to A.J. Seymour, Mittelholzer was known at the height of his career to millions of English-speaking people across the world. And his literary agent revealed that his books sold thousands of copies and were considered to be the hottest sellers in the paperback market. There is little doubt that at the beginning of his career, Mittelholzer's novels stood out as refreshingly different from his contemporaries in the West. On 24th May 1941, a Times literary supplement reviewer made the following remark about his published novel, A Quarantine Thunder. There is an odd beauty in this book, and a haunting pathos. Even more typical in terms of the adjectives used to describe Mittelholzer's novels was a review written by the well-known New York Times writer Orville Prescott in September 1951. The most original, the most peculiar, and in some ways the most diverting novel I have read this year is Shadows Move Among Them by Edgar Mittelholzer. This beautifully written, subtle, and intellectually challenging novel defies classification. It is a satire, a farce, and a fantasy, and also a study of a utopian society. It is extremely clever, deliciously comic, and occasionally quite grisly. Hyperbole aside, most agreed, at least in the first half of his career, that he was an accomplished novelist, with a tireless and entertaining imagination, a writer who was genuinely versatile, experimental, and intriguing. It was not uncommon, furthermore, to see his name being favorably compared to other great writers. His novel, My Bones and My Flute, was, for instance, described in the Daily Telegraph as being equal to the novels written by Joseph Thomas Sheridan Le Fanu, the leading ghost story writer of the 19th century. His talent was hailed by The Observer, following the publication of his 6th novel, The Life and Death of Sylvia, as one of the most surprising to have appeared in English literature for 20 years. Privy to these facts alone, one might assume that Mittelholzer's career had been a trouble-free, successful one. The reality is a lot more complex, and the aim of this paper is thus to outline some of the challenges that Mittelholzer faced on account of his socio-historical context, and in so doing make plain quite how extraordinary his achievements were. When Mittelholzer made the radical decision in 1928, following the completion of his first serious story, The Doubloon, to become a professional novelist, he was thought by his colored middle-class counterparts in New Amsterdam to be verging on the lunatic. To use John Figueroa's words, Mittelholzer was considered mad. He was a man who had decided to be a writer, and when he said it, it must have been really frightening to everyone else. Creative writing, as A.J. Seymour explained, was viewed by West Indians as the preserve of Americans or Europeans. Young colonials who thought otherwise were, apart from acting above their station, considered to be incapable of contributing anything new or noteworthy to the admired tradition of English literature. This view of the non-white colonial was indeed ubiquitous, as exemplified by George Bernard Shaw's response to Claude McKay's literary aspirations. "Tell me, young man, why do you want to write poetry? This is not your business. You should take up boxing like Jack Johnson, you know, not this sort of thing." Like most young men of similar background, Mittelholzer was expected to take up a respectable position in the civil service. This he did, but not for long. Tired of the race, color, class hierarchy, he soon tells his superior, like Horace, in a morning at the office to keep his blasted job. After a series of false starts and rejections of approximately 15 novels, Mittelholzer's first novel, Quarantine Thunder, was published. The long journey to success, without the emotional support of his family, had been mentally and physically draining. In the year prior to the novel's publication, Mittelholzer had been living in Georgetown, hand to mouth, supplementing his meager diet of peanuts and chocolate with a cocktail of vitamins, whilst living in a cubicle, triangular in shape, the mere screened-off section of a room for which he paid $3 a week. He recalled later in life, the reality at last, after the anguish of 1,000 massacred dreams, I did not celebrate. The daily struggle merely to eat and to keep alive was too exigent. And in a letter that I recently discovered to a friend, it was written in 1941, he disclosed, "Life has given my heart a pretty rough time. If disappointments used to leave tangible physical scars on one's heart, my heart would be found to be nothing but one great blurred, tough mass of calloused flesh." Patience and determination were evident strengths, for he was to wait another 9 years before the publication of his second novel, A Morning at the Office.
For me, the backyard. Play your carnival, play your mask, dance with your country club set, hop, jump at your midnight fete. For these things I'll never ask. Take them all and leave for me the backyard scene at dusk, the haze of blue wood smoke, morning mist amid mango leaves, and the Nancy Story fantasies that the cries of kiskadees from long, long ago evoke. Keep your calypsos and your steel bands, wiggle your hips and waggle your hands. For me, the good, soft, tingling dew, and mottled shadows beneath a guava tree, the glimmer, the dim, mysterious hue of coconut fronds, spider hands, immobile, enmeshed in the filigree, the plaited pattern of star apple and plum, breadfruit and mango, and the perpetual hum of all the insects hidden in Chumby lands. The magic a waning moon can weave, set free.
Meditations of a Man Slightly Drunk. I came, and they drunken me lightly with a medley of liquors. There was falernum. There were literary disagreements, poetical dissonances, yes, but chiefly there was rum. They talked to me of stanzas, the ancient and the very modern. They broached even painting, haggled about form. Over Epstein concorded with reverence, yes, but chiefly there was rum. We jabbered of pendulums that swung like my vision. They gesticulated and bawled, ranting about matter, utilizing imagery, yes, but never forgetting the rum. We slashed at Swinburne, and we justly kicked old Kipling. We grimaced dreadfully of Pater, how we hacked poor Don, and sniffed at Rupert Brooke, though always, mind, there was rum.
Creole Chip number 3. Mr. Beak, the magistrate, looked keenly from the face of the infant to the face of George Ben, the chauffeur, and said there seemed to him a striking resemblance between the two faces, so striking a resemblance that he, Mr. Beak, saw no reason why he should not award 3 shillings a week to Matilda Greaves. George, who was conducting his own defense, protested that his brother Charlie and he resembled each other closely, and that Charlie had also had dealings with Matilda Greaves. How then was the court to know that the child was not Charlie's? The magistrate frowned and scratched his head, admitting to himself that this was certainly a poser. But at this point, Charlie, who happened to be in the court, rose and said that his brother was lying, and that he had never had anything to do with Matilda. Whereupon Matilda exclaimed, "Oh, Charlie, you lie!" and the marshal called for order in the court. When the confusion had abated somewhat, George said that the child had a mole on its neck, exactly the same as the one which Charlie had on his neck. Charlie was called and examined, and sure enough, a mole was found on the neck of the child too, which corresponded exactly. But Charlie protested and said that the child had a mole on the part which he, the child, would one day use for sitting on, and that George also had a mole on the same part. So George was taken out of the courtroom and examined, and sure enough, the mole came to light. 1 and 6 a week from you, George, said the magistrate, and 1 and 6 a week from you, Charlie. Next case.
Creole Chip number 4. A papaw tree in Mrs. Jones' yard was leaning well over the fence and dropping dead leaves and, when rain fell, long trickles of water onto the delicate limbs of a rose plant in Mrs. Smith's yard. Mrs. Smith, who was very proud of her rose plants and extremely painstaking over them, wrote a friendly little note to Mrs. Jones. The note read, "Dear Mrs. Jones, I hope I'm not worrying you too much, but won't you try to get that papaw tree cut down? It keeps dropping leaves and water on my Marshall Neal rose plant, and I notice it's only a male papaw tree and doesn't bear. I trust you are well. Yours kindly, Maisie Smith." Mrs. Jones, on reading this, made an acid sound and crumpled up the note, telling the bedpost that she would see Mrs. Smith between the hinges before she cut down her papaw tree. A male papaw tree, is it? Well, just for that reason, it'll remain right where it is. Confound her Marshall Neal rose plant. So taking writing pad and pen, Mrs. Jones wrote back to Mrs. Smith as follows. "Dear Mrs. Smith, I think you are quite right about the papaw tree, my dear. It really seems so useless. I'm terribly sorry if it has damaged your Marshall Neal rose plant in any way. I'm going to see and have it cut down as soon as I can." Of course, the papaw tree has not been cut down. It still leans over the fence, but it no more drops leaves or water on Mrs. Smith's Marshall Neal rose plant, because Mrs. Smith's Marshall Neal rose plant died 2 months ago.
Creole Chip number 6. In New Amsterdam, at 12:15 a.m. one Tuesday, the rat trap placed on a high ledge in the dining room of Mistress Shrew caught a rat, and in doing so, fell from the ledge onto the glassware on the dinner wagon beneath. The crash roused the whole household, and lights were switched on. Voices emanated from the bedrooms, followed by footsteps and investigations. 2 glasses were discovered broken and the soup plate cracked. The blood of the dead rat, for it was one of those vicious catch-quick traps, had ruined the cloth on the upper shelf of the dinner wagon, and Mistress Shrew and our daughter, Catherine, set about to remove it. The broken glass was also collected and taken into the kitchen, and then Mistress Shrew and her daughter went back to bed. The following day, Mistress Moutley, Mistress Shrew's next-door neighbor, told Mistress Whispery of King Street that Mistress Shrew and her husband had a fight last night. "Me dear, you should have heard the breaking glass. He cut her with a razor and washed away the tablecloth with blood. Oh, it was disgraceful." 2 days later, Mistress Waits of Pope Street was told by Mistress Busy of St. Magdalene Street that 2 nights ago, Mr. Shrew chopped his wife with an axe. He broke 2 of her ribs, smashed up a wardrobe. Here she's in hospital in a terrible condition. Poor thing.
Creole Chip number 10. A cat belonging to Mrs. Reynolds of Allboystown one day happened to stray into the outdoor kitchenette of Mrs. Peters, her neighbor. The cat made off with a half a pound of raw steak, and Mrs. Peters, returning from a nearby vat with a bucket of water, arrived in time to see the animal gliding off, staking mouth, back into the muddy gloom of an alleyway. Mrs. Reynolds, frying salt fish and onions and singing, "Cheese, you lover of my soul," heard a loud scream of "Oh my God!" from Mrs. Peters. So what was wrong? Mrs. Peters, in a voice of great fury, told her to look what her so-and-so, censored cat, had gone and done. Run off with a whole half-pound of steak. Now, Mrs. Reynolds was not particularly in love with Mrs. Peters, and this fact, coupled with the fact of Mrs. Peters calling her cat a so-and-so cat, annoyed Mrs. Reynolds so much that this lady informed Mrs. Peters in a rather sarcastic voice that she had not told her to leave her steak where the cat could get it. Mrs. Peters, putting her arms akimbo, lifted up her voice to the whole neighborhood and asked the neighborhood to look at her cross this good morning. Whereupon Mrs. Reynolds, unperturbed, broke forth once more into a lusty rendering of "Cheese, you lover of my soul." This was more than Mrs. Peters could stand. So, taking up her bucket of water, she strode rapidly forward and drenched Mrs. Reynolds from head to filarial foot. The matter was finally settled in a magistrate's court, and the newspapers referred to the case in a short paragraph headed, "3 cats and a steak."
Mary Barker uttered a groan or a sigh as she swept. Sometimes she wagged her head without making any sound. She was plumply built. She lacked grace of movement and walked with a slight up and down motion, the result of an injury to her left leg many years ago. Her dark face wore an expression of weariness, and every step she took seemed to call for a special effort of will. Not that this prevented her from doing a thorough job. She was a conscientious worker and by no means lazy. As soon as she had finished sweeping the office, she would trudge more than a mile to the two-room hovel on Gonzales Hill, which was her home, and set to work on her washing. The $4 a week she got from the office was not enough to support her and her two sons. So she took in washing from well-off families in the city. Peter, she was determined, must continue going to school. Other mothers often took their sons from school at 14 and put them to work. But she wanted Peter to go on until he was at least 16.
Here are the ruins. Immediately ahead of them, the track opened into a small clearing in which crumbling brick walls, creeper-grown and mossy walls of what must once have been a smallish house loomed against the background of jungle. The sky could now be seen, but in patches only, for the foliage roof, though thinner, still persisted. Tall palms grew singly within the clearing, their fronds linked together by rope-like vines. A pale, greenish-brown twilight pervaded the scene, as though the moss and creepers that covered the broken walls exuded a dim radiance of their own. Rusty red sand showed between the twigs and dry leaves that thinly carpeted the ground, so that a lake of blood, thought Gregory, might have subsided and left behind its ruddy hue. The silence had an ethereal, intelligent quality. There was no vacuum here, but a vibrant, replete livingness, a world of voices on the verge of sound, a shadow crowd shifty just beyond the edge of vision. Death and life seemed to whirl with equal strength in the elusive aromas that continually smote the senses. Are you afraid? He shook his head, but his manner was alert and listening. All about them was a whispering or a breathing. It might be insects invisibly on the move in the undergrowth, and it might be he saw stone steps and what looked like a large copper basin green with mold half buried. A length of rusted chain protruded from under a clump of ferns. The links seemed as though they would crumble to dust at the touch of a finger. To the left of him, not many yards away, a purple-green slab lay at a slant, partly buried. He had a glimpse of a skull and crossbones and words, hair light begraven, leaves and moss, 1764. All the tombs around here, she said, have skulls and crossbones engraved on them. They stood for a while longer, looking about them silently. In Gregory, the sensation increased that they were not alone.
This is the foreword from Children of Kaiwana by, of course, our own Edgar Mittelholzer. So little is known about the history of British Guyana, even in the colony itself and its British neighboring colonies in the West Indies, that I felt compelled to add occasional footnotes to this work, more so than is usual in a work of fiction, and to include, at the end of the book, a list of the persons who actually lived and of the events that actually occurred. Without these footnotes and this list, the reader would be at a loss to know what is fact and what is fiction, though I have no doubt that many will probably read this tale simply as a tale, not caring two hoots about the historical background. So much the better for them if they can. But at the same time, I have to think of the others who might be interested in the historical angle. In the instance of the Berbice insurrection, according to James Rodway in his History of British Guyana, probably the most disastrous slave revolt that ever occurred in any colony. I have stuck as closely to historical fact as I possibly could, as, indeed, I have done in respect to other factual events. I should like to explain, however, that Amelia George's first name is not on record. I have searched everywhere, in Georgetown as well as the British Museum, without being able to trace it. Rodway refers to her simply as Miss George, and Dalton as a young lady. Amelia is therefore my own invention. The ultimate fate of several of the survivors of Pierre Boom incident can only be conjectured at, as the records again are very hazy. The Zubli family, we must assume, perished, as did the parents of Amelia George. We know that the pedicant Ramring and his family were spared to join the governor and his party shortly after the massacre. Jan Carbon and Mittenholzer wandered around in the bush for a fortnight before Jan was captured. Mittenholzer, according to Jan's account, was attacked but resisted, cutting off the hand of one of his assailants with a saber. He too must have succeeded in reaching the governor and his party in safety. There is a saber in the possession of my family, which is said to be the very one used by my ancestor in this encounter. I have seen it myself in the home of my uncle, the late Major John Vincent Mittenholzer.
Small things that might have left no impression on her sisters made a lasting impression on Louise. She had been born with a sensitive, easily impressionable nature. And she was mercurial. Even the sudden rustling of the trees in a soft wind might affect her mood, cause her to fidget and glance about with an abrupt longing for something she could not define. She became irritated over trifles, and trifles, too, might send her into ecstasies of pleasure. She lived intensely and richly. Each moment was for her, deeply shadowed or brilliantly lit, ripely colored or blackly smeared. One day, about a fortnight after her encounter with Edward, she stared across the dining table at her father, and tears began to run down her cheeks. She stopped eating and dried them, but not before the others had seen them. "What is the matter with you, Louise?" asked Rosalind. "Nothing, mother, nothing." And it was the truth. It was nothing that she could explain. She had just been touched by the stolid, lonely expression on her father's face, and tears had flowed. Yet, she had seen that expression 1,000 times before, ever since she had known herself. Mary and Susan grunted, and Hubertus smiled vaguely, and her mother did not persist in questioning her, for they were accustomed to her moods. Towards the end of the meal, Louise said, "Father, has any strange man been seen by the overseers on our plantation?" Her father did not look up from his plate, but he grew alert. She noted this. Mary exclaimed, "A strange man? What do you mean, Louise? A black man? Asked Suzanne. No, a white man.
My Bones and My Flute by Edgar Mittelholzer, Chapter 2. It is true that, as I have mentioned, I am a romantic, but under my romanticism, I am a strong rationalist. And I can state quite frankly that not for an instant did I believe that any supernatural influences were responsible for the incident that I have just described. I was convinced that there must be some natural explanation for the fact that Jessie and her father could hear a flute while I could not. So, without delay, I told her to sit in my chair and wait until I returned. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going down to make some inquiries in the lower deck. Let me come with you. I don't think your mother would like the idea of a respectable young lady like her daughter venturing among the rabble of the lower deck. She told me to stop being sarcastic and accompanied me below. The second mate and I were already acquainted. He was one of my barber's shop companions in debate. In reply to my inquiry, he said, "A ukulele and a mouth organ the only instrument we got down here, so far as I know. But what about the passengers? Are you sure none of them have been playing a flute during the past few minutes?" "No, Mr. Woodsley, not down here. I've been here all the time. I would hear it, only Michelle and his ukulele been playing." "But I am positive I heard a flute," said Jessie. "My father heard it too, and it came from down here." The second mate smiled and shook his head. "Not down here, miss. I can swear to that. Nobody didn't play no flute on this deck today. Aubrey, one of the deck hands, got a mouth organ, and Michelle there got his ukulele. And that's the only musical instrument I hear on this boat. None of the passengers didn't play no instruments since we left town this morning." As we returned to the upper deck, Jessie said, "Well, that's the queerest thing I've ever known to happen. If it wasn't a human being who played the flute, then it must have been a zombie, because I did hear it as plainly as I can hear you speak."
No doubt it has happened to other people too, and is therefore nothing new, but nevertheless, it is an interesting fact that many a time I have known myself to sit and watch trees and buildings and traffic, and found myself, for no reason that I could explain, abruptly engulfed in a whirl of illusion. A kind of vacuum of ephemerality, an air pocket in my consciousness, which, while I knew it would not last more than a brief space, was at the same time disturbing. Disturbing because it tended to upset the values I have painfully established concerning what is real and what is not. Call it a mystical experience if you will, but whatever it may be, the fact remains that in such moments I am aware, or at least tell myself that I am aware of a shadow voice, which assures me that there's no substance in the scene I am beholding, that everything I discern is simply a grand imposture thrust upon me through the artifices of my functioning nervous system. The buildings I am looking at, I would be made to feel, are composed of matter subject to corrosion and therefore insecure, not to be trusted. At any instant, they may disintegrate in a cloud of dust. The traffic is merely metal marshaled into form and order and set into motion. In an instant, perhaps, it will oxidize softly into fine brown rust and be washed away as so much silt. And the trees are shedding their leaves, and like the humans hurrying by under them, are in a state of perpetual chemical flux, the cells of which they are composed in seething billions are breaking down with the passage of every second. Complete extinction is a mere matter of accumulated seconds and minutes. In short, everything, all the mobility, all the aliveness, all the pregnant vigor of this array of symbols that shimmers in my awareness is, in reality, death. Death in the guise of movement and sunshine. Death in the guise of green leaves and a pattern of sounds. Death in the guise of human figures loving and fearing and fretting over the making of money.